Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcy Henson. I'm the Director of the Clark County Department of Environment and Sustainability, and welcome to our July meeting for the Clark County Transportation Electrification Working Group. We appreciate your time today working on making progress toward a regional electrification strategy. So today we'll do some quick introductions. We'll provide you all an update on our work. We're going to talk a little bit about the results of the survey we did on potential options for an ordinance that will help us narrow down how we retrieve cost information from developers. We'll talk a little bit about the cost estimate templates that we've prepared, and then we will do Q&A for the public and interested parties that are joining us, and we'll talk about next steps. So for introductions, we'll kind of do a roll call for members. I will announce the membership, and if you're on the line or attending the meeting representing the organization, please say hello and introduce yourself. So Chispa. All right, City of Boulder City.
Hey, it's Joe Stubitz with the City of Boulder City. Glad to be here.
Hi, Joe. Thank you. City of Henderson. All right. City of Las Vegas. City of North Las Vegas. Clark County School District. All right, we have a lot of people out. I told April and Randy that this is the time of year when everyone in Vegas goes their way to San Diego. So, NAOP.
Hi, Marcy, Rod Martin. I'm still here in Las Vegas along with you.
Thank you. Nevada Climate Initiative. All right, Nevada Department of Transportation.
Hi, Christina Swallow. I'm here. I wasn't paying close enough attention. You caught me off guard.
No problem. Nevada Division of Environmental Protection.
Hi, Greg Lovato with NDEP here.
Hi, Greg.
Hello.
NV Energy. Nevada Governor's Office of Energy.
Good afternoon. It's Chris Naylor. I'm happy to be here also.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. Nevada Resort Association.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Nevada State Apartment Association. RTC.
Hi, everyone. Deb Reardon with RTC.
Julio Ortiz with RTC.
Roger Johnson with RTC.
Southern Nevada Water Authority. Sweep.
Angie Dykma with Sweep.
Thank you. Hi, Angie. The Electrification Coalition.
Everybody, Will Dreyer with the EC.
And Western Resource Advocates.
Everyone, this is Aaron Kresick with Western Resource Advocates.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Marcy, Andy Powell from City of Henderson. I showed up after you got past Henderson, I think.
Okay, no problem. Did I miss anyone else?
Hey, Marcy, you skipped over SNHBA. I don't see Matt Walker on, who's our rep, but Nat Hodgson and I are both here. Amanda Moss for the rep.
I'm sorry about that, Amanda and Nat. Yes, SNHBA, thank you so much for joining us. All right, so if you are participating today and you have a question or would like to make a comment, you're more than welcome to do that in the chat. And you can use the reaction to raise your hand. We'll also have time at the end reserved for Q&A. For people who are joining us that are interested parties or member of the public, if you wouldn't mind in the chat introducing yourself, your name and organization, we'd appreciate it. All right, April, and I think it's back to you. Thank you. And just one second here, and I will get that going. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We are, and I'm just trying to take off your pin there, Marcy, really quick for your spotlight. All right. Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. And I know that we have a couple of new members, so I am going to go ahead and just give you a brief overview about the Transportation Electrification Working Group. We have been doing the working group since December of last year, and we meet monthly. And our goal is to develop a strategy by the end of the year for transportation electrification. And so we will each month, we go through different parts of that strategy. We've had educational meetings up until this point, just talking about all the different types of transportation electrification. And most recently, we've started the discussion on a ordinance, a model ordinance for the county and the cities. This ordinance, the whole goal of an ordinance is to help increase the adoption of electric vehicles. And so with the survey, what we wanted to do is to get feedback from our members and specifically help tailor how we're going to create estimates for installations for either new development, existing development. We have some worksheets that we've put together, but we thought that we would go ahead and start now with just giving you what those results were and how we came up with formatting these worksheets. And then the idea behind those worksheets is that we'll have standardized way of looking at the cost estimates for each of the use cases. So I will go ahead and jump right in, and you can put your questions in the chat, as Marcy said as well. We had 30 respondents to the survey, and thank you to everyone who submitted their information. We sent the survey out twice to the Transportation Electrification Working Group members and to their interested parties. And it was also shared by our members with some of their groups, which was fantastic. So of the 30 respondents, you may not see 30 organizational names there, but we had a few where a couple from a particular organization submitted. And then also we had people from the other organizations responded, but they didn't include their names. And just to give you some of the background on who took this survey, the city that a majority of our members were located in was the city of Las Vegas. However, we did have quite a few that had more of a regional presence within the city, so within the county. So either they're from the state and they're included in the county, or they had all of the cities that are part of their jurisdiction, or where their organization operates, for example, for dealerships, things like that. And then those that most participated and which best describes their organization was government. And you'll see down there what the other entailed. We did have quite a few residential developers for single family as well. And so one of the questions that we asked is, do you agree or disagree that Clark County and the region cities should adopt an electric vehicle charging infrastructure ordinance to meet the growing demand of EVs? And 70% of the respondents said they either strongly agree or somewhat agree that an ordinance should be implemented. When it comes to EV charging development, we asked, in your opinion, if an EV charging infrastructure ordinance was enacted, should it apply only to new development or to both new and existing development? And you can see here, 37% said only new development. Coming in a close second
was the both new and existing, but for existing only when substantial improvements were permitted. So the difference between those and the last one that you see there is that the last one was both new and existing for existing development only when substantial improvements were permitted, but that triggered additional parking requirements. So those are the difference between the three that you see there. We also have the EV charging land use types. So we looked at, we asked which of the following land use types should an EV charging infrastructure ordinance apply, which you see in blue there. And we had a tie between the top three and very close fourth and fifth. So for multifamily residential, retail and shopping centers, resorts and hotels, and then office parks. And you can see the rest of the list there. We also had, if you see in the green, which of these land use types should be exempt from the EV charging infrastructure ordinance. So in the green, you can see some of those recommendations for being exempt would be single family residential, affordable housing, custom homes. And then we also had a tie with none of the above. So for example, if you didn't want any of the above to be exempt, then you would choose that. So those were the results there. We also added, we requested to elaborate on the land use types that you chose to be exempt. And so as you'll see here, and you'll receive this deck, so don't feel like you have to read it all right now, but we will, I'll just give you some of the highlights that are there right now. Some of the reasons why they chose what should be exempt were cost requirements. It should be a choice, not a requirement. Our target would be tier 2 and 3, so more outlying areas. It would be difficult to ask for those within the urban core. Let's see, on the next one, it should be up to the consumer to choose. The following one, requiring schools and universities to build the infrastructure will cost more for taxpayers for little benefit. We also had keeps costs lower. I don't believe in government mandating EVs. EVs are bad for the environment, would cause more criminal activity having to park a vehicle in a central charging area. Should be left to the individual homeowner. The limited time people spend in these locations seems to contradict a need to charge a vehicle. Only new houses, limited budgets available, should be limited, and then affordable housing projects need a rebate program of some sort, in my opinion. I'll go ahead and stop there for a second and just see if anyone has any questions or feedback regarding the information that I've shared so far. And you can feel free to unmute. I do see a couple of questions, but I think that was disregarded there. So any other feedback or questions so far? All right. Okay.
Hey, April, I have a question. This is Amanda with the Southern Nevada Home Builders. Just since it seems we did circulate the survey and it seems like a lot of the respondents were from our members. Could you see who said what or from what perspective they were coming from when they did mention why something should be exempt?
Yes, we do have all of that data. So it shows who participated, their organization, and then the comments that they talked about. So we do have that.
Is it possible to see, this is Virginia, how many respondents there were in each of those categories? Because I wonder when I see some of these numbers, was that like one person or 2 people or 10 people on your last chart?
Yes. So we had the 30 respondents total. We had about 27 respondents for the multifamily segment, and it switched between about 24 and 25 for the other segments responding. Some chose just to, answer questions based on their use type, but a majority of people actually answered all of the questions. Does that help?
Yes, I guess depending on how this information is used, I think it needs to be explained exactly who the respondents were. So I don't think you can say this is representative of the community at large because of the number of response from certain industries or not, or the absence from others. It's just kind of interesting. So I understand you're using this to develop the cost tool, but yeah, I think we have to be really careful how this data is used.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what you're saying, Virginia, because 30 surveys received. I mean, typically you would want to see a lot more responses than that. We did send it out to our 142 members and interested parties. So you're right. Each of the 30 respondents are going to be weighted much heavier than if you were to have 100 respondents.
So, I mean, if you ask everybody in this same group, who should pay more taxes, I think I know what the answer would be. It wouldn't necessarily mean that that was representative of, certain stakeholders.
Yeah. Rod, I see you have a question. You might be muted if you're speaking.
Thank you, April. So just following up on Virginia's point there, one thing that I did not do, and maybe I misunderstood and should have done, was I didn't, forward the questionnaire to the NAIOP membership that, in all likelihood, you would have received, many more responses to that, from the commercial development industry. So if that was what the intentions were, then I apologize for not distributing amongst the larger membership. I just, spoke with the board and we just submitted the one response.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. And that's exactly what we were looking for. Not necessarily, if you wanted to send it out, you were more than welcome to, but really it is just to shape those estimates. But then along with those questions, we did ask these. So we thought that it would be helpful at least to go through and have you see the results of what everyone said. Anything else? Okay, so of these three, the standard types of EV charging, we talked about that before in a previous presentation, the difference between EV capable parking spaces, EV ready, and EV chargers installed. So of these three most standard types of EV charging infrastructure configurations, which one should Clark County and the region cities require in the ordinance? So 40% said the EV capable parking spaces. So this would include the conduit and the circuit, but what it would not include is all the wiring up to the charger. And then it would not require the EV charger to be installed. So that's what we based kind of the worksheet templates off of. For registration data, should the county and the cities use projected EV registration data as a baseline for determining the percentage of parking spaces impacted by the ordinance? 50% said yes. Of those that said no, the reason why was that they said, projections can vary widely, or there's a large transient population of vehicles that won't be registered in Nevada. Another one said that there is a possibility that we will exceed 25% level previously referenced, allow the jurisdiction to set and establish their parking standards. I don't believe the government should be mandating. Another one said current guidelines based on current registration and revisit it in 3 years and up the spaces if you need at that time. Another one said that for light duty vehicle sales, they're actually going to approach 100% of EVs in the next 10 to 15 years. So we should future-proof buildings to include the conduit and wiring to facilitate the installation of EV charging. And then lastly was infrastructure needs to be in place and accessible, but the homeowner needs to pay, and they do not think that it is the business's responsibility. In looking at the parking spaces, so one of the things that we asked was for single family homes, for home garages, choose your preferred EV charging ordinance structure for which the working group will develop cost estimates for discussion. So the number one that was chosen was parking spaces require a level 2 outlet at 240 volt. And second was parking space requires a level 1 outlet, 120 volt. And then just for other, they said consumers should have the option of deciding. EV charger should be an option. It should be available as an option to potential buyers, and the homeowner can decide if they want to, if they want charging connected or not, but it should be available. Looking in the EV charging parking spaces for multifamily, most were unsure of what number of spaces to choose. So of what additional number of new parking spaces would trigger an EV charging infrastructure ordinance. And most either were, like I mentioned, were unsure, they didn't know, but EV chargers should be an option. Any construction in the parking area should trigger EV infrastructure requirements, 20 available to charge in multifamily. If a new multifamily development is being constructed, it should include EV infrastructure, and then it should be left up to the developer. And the next one there was 25 parking spaces. So for non-residential development for office, parks, retail, and shopping centers, at what point should the project trigger the EV charging infrastructure ordinance? And 100 spaces by the group that participated was the overwhelming winner there. Some other comments were no additional spaces required, same as handicapped, and I don't think that there should be a floor. So if there's a new development or substantial model, it should come with EV infrastructure. For resorts, hotels, schools, colleges, universities, convention facilities, culture and entertainment. So same question, at what point should the project trigger the EV charging infrastructure? 50 parking spaces was the overwhelming, well, not overwhelming winner there, but that and other. And Randy, can you admit anyone else who's trying to join the meeting? So 50 parking spaces got 33%, but also for other, the number of parking spaces should be significantly higher based upon the scope and scale of the category definitions. Someone else said that consideration should be given to the scale and time spent at resorts when considering requirements for charging stations. Let's see, I think resort hotels should have a low threshold. Schools, colleges, and universities, I think, should be exempt. And then no additional spaces required. Same as handicapped. And then if there's a new development or substantial remodel, it should include EV infrastructure. For non-residential development of distribution, manufacturing, and industrial, at what point should a project trigger the EV charging infrastructure ordinance? So that would be 37% said 100 spaces. And of the other mentioned, there should be spaces designated regardless of size, that it should not be hired, same as handicapped. I don't think there should be a floor, and it's important not to over-engineer infrastructure that will never be used. Then we asked which scenarios which scenarios for all use types and cost estimates would you choose? And for each use type, for multifamily, offices, distribution, resorts, hotels, schools, entertainment, they chose scenario 1, which tended to have the lowest impact of charging, except for resorts and hotels that tied with scenario number 3, which is why you see them in the green box there, 2 in the green box there.
I have a question about this, April.
Sure.
It seems like once you've set up the model for developing these cost estimates, that you could basically provide cost estimates for all scenarios, right? I mean, you're going to have a cost estimate per space or something, and maybe it changes depending on how many spaces you're preparing, but
Exactly. So the scenario was really to help us standardize the cost estimates that we're getting back, because there were so many different types of cost. As we started going through all the different use cases, there was a lot that we could choose from. So this was just to help give us some like oranges to oranges, if at all possible, way to standardize those estimates. And Marcy, feel free to chime in too if you have any feedback there.
Yeah, so, what the board asked us to do was to bring back some information on outreach to business and industry, the community, interested parties with regard to a potential electric vehicle ordinance. And so what we were trying to do with the survey is to understand of the information that we've learned through the first 6 months or so of this process about where people do charging, how much charging we have, how much charging we're likely to need, what are the kinds of sales numbers looking at now, what are the projections of those sales numbers, and then what are some lessons learned from other municipalities and counties that have done this. What seems like 3 reasonable scenarios on which to get the input of the working group. So we definitely aren't going to represent this as some sort of public surveying, but we absolutely are going to represent this as the results of the survey of the working group and the interested parties who've been participating in this process. And then of that, trying to understand of those scenarios and the kinds of reaction we're getting from those scenarios, positive, opposition, neutrality, what would those scenarios cost in each of these different kinds of development categories. So just trying to understand what would be the difference between business as usual and the cost if we were to enact either scenario 1, 2, or 3. And we wanted to narrow that down based on where we were going to have the most interest, support, least opposition, most neutrality, however you want to kind of characterize that.
This is Virginia again. So as a follow-up question, what consideration was given to, for example, how NAIOP feels about office parks, or how resorts feel about resorts, or how builders feel about single family or multi-family? Was this, or just, you're giving people who are not going to be charged with the implementation or bearing the cost kind of have equal weight with the people who will be responsible?
Yeah, we are including a broad set of the community, and in some cases that includes impacted business and industry. In other cases it includes residents and interested parties to the working group. In other cases it's advocates. We were asked to go get a broad range of feedback to the ordinance. So yeah.
And I can tell you that of the respondents that did not include their organizations, from their responses in some parts, they said that they were with a single family developer. So I think that it did skew, the respondents skewed higher towards developers than it did anyone else.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose we could articulate, since we took that demographic data, if you will, at the beginning of the survey, we can articulate also in one of these responses, Virginia, this is how many people indicated that they were from this development community or an advocacy community or general member of the public.
And Marcy, I guess I'm trying to be too diplomatic here. I just think that it's interesting that people who really maybe are not stakeholders in what happens at a resort are making that decision for resorts, and basically vice versa for any of these other categories. For example, would have been really easy for me to say, oh, I think every new single family home should have, the best possible of charging options. but because I'm never gonna have to worry about that, right? I'm not gonna have to worry about how to do it or market it, save it, implement it, build the infrastructure that goes with it. So I guess maybe I'm asking a rhetorical question, but I do appreciate the response.
Yeah, like I said, I think we can indicate the how many responses we got from each category. And then that way that'll help put it in the proper context. And, you know, when you guys are talking with either folks that you represent or with the board, you can highlight that. I hope that folks can appreciate that local government has to represent a broad group of stakeholders. And so I think it's fair to indicate when we're talking about this, how many stakeholders from each industry or from each category, I guess, is represented in the response. But I don't think that as local government, we can eliminate interested parties just because they won't be directly impacted. They're participating because they have an interest and because they, you know, they would like to have input as well. I think your point is well taken about who's going to bear the cost and implementation impact. And, you know, we can certainly, I think, all make that point as we talk to our elected officials who asked us to go out and collect this information.
Great. There was a question by Amanda Moss, and Amanda, feel free to add some more information about this question, but it says for residential development, specifically the multifamily, has an analysis been done on the number of units versus number of parking spaces. And so for this one, we did look at the number of parking spaces. And are you saying that you would prefer it to be a number of units versus parking spaces?
It was just a question on the analysis of what's being built right now versus how you guys structure each of the tiers to see, you know, is 20% feasible with the way multifamily or even townhomes distributes their parking spaces and the ratios that are in planning and development code now. Just a question on how you guys structured each of the tiers for our.
Yeah, Amanda, that's a good question. We, you know, we kind of went by what seems to be happening at a pretty standard level across other municipalities or counties who are adopting ordinances like this. And we just focused on the number of parking spaces. And we didn't do it based on units. So that's just how we chose to go about it. We think probably keeping that consistency in any proposed ordinance would make it a bit easier for folks that are looking at the code and having to, you know, like do staff analysis for the code. But yeah, that seems to be most common.
Okay, no, that's helpful. And I guess the reason I asked the question is, you know, for some of these product types, you may meet your minimum parking ratios with 2 public spots and 1 garage spot. So how would the 20% actually be laid out in the design of a community, especially with some of the uncertainties with the infrastructure and where is that going to be? Of course, it's a lot cheaper to bring, you know, the conduit and the transformers to one area versus scattered all the way throughout, and you have to upgrade, you know, for the entire community. So I don't know if this is maybe a premature question, because I know one of the questions was, you know, who determines where the spaces are located, and I know you know, we echo a lot of the comments that Virginia makes. Of course, it's easy when other people are answering the question for you versus the development community does want the ability to, you know, pick those locations. So I think I'll just, I appreciate that. I'll yield the floor and look forward to the rest.
Yeah, I think April will preview that, and maybe the thing we had the most consensus on was the answer to this question. So that's fantastic.
Yeah. So then taking these scenarios and then applying the data that we received just in the slides before that was talking about recommendations as to which, you know, how should we, what number of parking spaces should apply to each of these scenarios. We then did apply that information, and we had changes in 3 of the use types. So for multifamily communities, it was reduced from 50 to 25. For resorts, it was increased in a couple locations from 25 to 50, and then decreased from 100 to 50. There was no change to office parks. And then for distribution and manufacturing and industrial, it was reduced from 150 to 100. So then what we did was take this information, use this, these numbers as the scenario, and then apply them to the estimate worksheets. And then to answer your question, Andrea, 97% said yes. Should the location of the EV parking spaces within the parking lot be left to the discretion of the developer? So that was an overwhelming yes. So I'll stop there and just see if there are any questions before we jump into what I'll provide an example of what the worksheets look like. And I can also go into these additional comments as well. Any other question before I jump into these comments? Okay. So for additional comments, we just asked, what other comments do you have about the model EV charging infrastructure ordinance? For the first one here, the ordinance should also require shaded parking with solar. Second, cost considerations of both charging units and the electrical infrastructure should be accounted for. The next one, EV requirements may prematurely require resorts to make complicated decisions about investing in existing buildings and parking structures for EVs at a time when consumer preferences, technologies, and EVs are rapidly evolving and before the distribution infrastructure is ready. The next one, incentives help to offset the cost, and there were quite a few mentions about incentives. It should be left to the free market. Over on the right-hand side, incentives for developers deciding to go above and beyond the minimum requirements and incentivizing solar-covered parking. Next, where cars spend much of their time, residential, hotels, and resorts. So this person said, again, I would focus on where cars spend most of their time, which is residential. And in our unique destination, it could also apply to hotels and resorts. I generally marked not sure because it's impossible to determine the potential costs of the various scenarios on development. Shouldn't Clark County, the city of Las Vegas, etc., be required to install the same infrastructure as private industry would be? And then based on an ordinance with uniform standards, regionally operated or regionally adopted with minimum standards would be helpful. Other features that are municipally preferred or optional should also be included. And then incentives should be part of that.
I have a question. Is there any preclusion of incentives if somebody chooses to charge for their EV charging or charge a fee?
We actually haven't gotten that specific yet, and I'm not sure if I've actually ever seen that, and I don't know if you've seen that, Randy. So the question is, if someone is going to charge for parking or for the electricity, would that then negate them from being able to receive an incentive? And that's not something that I've seen.
No, I haven't seen that. I think it's expected that billing would take place in a lot of the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think what, when Randy demonstrated previously is when you don't charge, that's when you get people, coming and, doing all of their charging there. For example, if you're at a workplace and not charging it all at home. So then it tends to, you have some taking advantage of that. So what we've seen is that charging at least the smallest amount does tend to keep that from happening. Other questions or other comments included even optioning one new EV charger in a single family community requires designing the entire community's electrical infrastructure as if all homes in the community will have EV chargers. Another one was the ordinance seems more practical for new development that than existing property retrofits. Some condo owners say that they can't hook up or install EV chargers. The power grid will not be able to handle this EV trend. On the right-hand side, someone said they strongly encourage letting the market dictate what EV infrastructure is needed and incentives are the best course of action. This person prefers time was spent on creating mass transit instead of this because it would add to housing costs, which everyone is already very concerned about. And lastly, the incentives and the program requirement should be predictable to offset the cost of this increased capacity to balance affordability concerns with the need for cleaner air. A grace period should be built in to acknowledge that communities could have approved designs or be under construction when this change goes into effect. So those are the comments that we received there, and I will stop sharing my screen and then reshare again with the templates, but I'll just open it up to see if there's any other feedback.
I have one question. This is Jason from MGM, and I was thinking back to the presentation that you gave on the Orlando ordinance, and it seemed that through stakeholder engagement, the application of electric vehicle infrastructure evolved considerably. And I think they ultimately arrived at a place where it was 10% of spaces EV capable, 2% EV installed. The threshold begins at 250 spaces, and that the requirements would only apply to new projects and substantial enlargements of existing projects. And in so much as that enlargement required new parking. So it would apply to new parking as a result of the substantial enlargement only. The previous terminology that they used was substantial improvement to an existing project. Can you help us understand, I mean, as you review, interpret the survey results, how you would distinguish, or how the ordinance could or should distinguish between a substantial improvement versus a substantial enlargement?
Mm-hmm. Marcy, do you want to take the first shot at that?
Yeah, I think we'd have to work on that definition, Jason, and kind of figure out where we land on that. I don't have a great definitive answer, but I think, we're open to understanding what particularly the resorts feel about that. And what we liked about the Orlando model was that it was clear about, it cleared up this retrofit question or this reach back question, and was trying to be focused on new development, or if you were in this scenario where you were making a substantial improvement, enlargement. So, I think we're open to figure out what makes the most sense to folks. And that's everything from just focus on new construction to is there a place and time when it's appropriate to require the infrastructure on some sort of improvement.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Marcy.
And if you guys, if you have something you really love and you would agree to today, you can pop it in the chat. And if not, we'll keep talking.
I think we'll get there eventually. I think there's one thing that I know that just for the record would be problematic, and that is a substantial improvement that would constitute something like a retrofit or a remodel that would trigger an EV requirement, just more broadly, because resort hotels, I'll just use our business as an example, are in Las Vegas in particular, are massive facilities. And so when you do, say, a remodel of a restaurant to maybe a different use, that could trigger different parking requirements. I mean, a change in use can trigger a different parking requirement. So we would want to move away from that type of basis.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. That definitely makes sense to me.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? Okay, so I'm just gonna quickly share the worksheets that we developed, and I'll go over those with you. And what I'll go ahead and do is I'll email the deck and these worksheets out to you following this meeting, just so that you have them. And if you do want to jump in right away and provide your feedback on these cost estimates, we would like that. So each use case has one. We just have some introductory remarks about the whys and the what fors, and I'll jump down to that scenario 1. So that scenario matches on the slide deck that you saw for the office parks, retail, and shopping centers. And we have some requests for you in this worksheet, which would be, and I'll go down here, just to select the projects that you want to represent, determine the original project costs in the chart we provide, determine the project costs, including this scenario number 1, determine the cost differences. So just subtract the original costs from the scenario 1 costs. We have some follow-up questions. And then also in the appendix, we do have a confidentiality statement that tells you that we are just going to use kind of this information broadly, and we won't be providing any specifics. So this gives you an idea of what those information that we're requesting just about the projects in general. And then this gives you an idea of what we're requesting for the project costs. So if you have 3 projects that you can provide us, that's great. I know that for the county, we'll be, submitting 3 projects. If there's 1 project you can provide us, that's also great. So, and then you'll see also the load down there at the bottom. And then this is just what the costs would be with the ordinance and the scenario included. So you can see it's the same cost, but now we're including the information regarding the ordinance. You'll see the line extension agreement, the applicant total cost responsibility is there, and then what the differences would be. And then just a couple of follow-up questions at the bottom, and then we have the confidentiality statement. So every single template is set up like that. Are there any questions about the templates, or is there another template you would prefer to see while we're all here?
So just a couple of notes, April. We have shared this with Marie Steele. She's been participating in our working group, particularly for that line extension Rule 9 line item that is of good question and concern to folks. So we could have gone a lot of different ways in which we could have described that line item and sort of what goes into that. So, and many of you know it much better than I do, but just, do we use the original total applicant costs? Do we subtract out refunds? Do we engage in disclosing the true ups between the project developer and NV Energy? And we boiled it down to just trying to understand what the difference is in that total upfront project applicant cost. I think Marie is willing to work with folks on getting that particular data and that particular information. And so she's happy to work with folks on helping retrieve information from those line extension agreements to disclose there. She asked about if somebody contacts her and if NV Energy and the developer believes that it's a more accurate and true description, if some of those other considerations about refunds and true ups, et cetera, was the number that got disclosed, if that would be acceptable. It would be acceptable to the county as long as there's sort of a description of, we varied from that total applicant cost and we included basically what ends up being the reconciled balance at the end of the project. And I know that can go on for a while. So we would leave it to the discretion of the developer who responds and NV Energy to work that out. Just if you could make sure that you indicate that to us in the response, so we know that it's not that total applicant cost, but it represents basically what ends up being the reconciled number. And we can work with you all offline as well. If you have questions or, want to pick our brains about these cost differences. There's a variety of different ways we could have gone about it. And so this is sort of where we landed. And what we're really most focused on understanding is what is the difference between what your costs are now and what they would be if we enacted these scenarios. That's what's most important to be able to give back to the Board of County Commissioners.
And Deborah Reardon, I know that you posted a comment that we should also be including the benefits in addition to the costs on the worksheet. And did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I just thought it might provide a little bit more balance that, even though there is a cost, what that greenhouse gas reduction could be, could be calculated based on, that particular use is generating X number of trips. And by providing EV charging, you're incentivizing, a cleaner trip. So it's just an idea to kind of just show the full picture that this isn't a cost for no reason.
Mm-hmm. That's a great comment. That's a great comment. Anything else? Yes, Rod and then Greg. Rod.
Hi, April and Marcy. And this goes kind of back to the NV Energy and, with our sample project. And I'm thinking, probably going to the higher end of the extreme, on a resort project. And I don't know how many parking spaces they have, but, probably thousands of parking spaces. And, when you look at that and you get into a line extension agreement, we're going to need some information from NBE on that, because if you're talking, hundreds of spaces and you're talking 20 or 40 amps, per station, we don't know, what the resort, developer wouldn't know what that cost disparity may be when they submit their line extension agreement for what their standard power would be to operate the property versus the additional for what, could be a very, large amount of additional power required.
Yeah, we fully understand that, Rod. And so that's why we asked Marie to look at this survey that we were going to be providing and to give us some assurances. And I get to talk on her behalf because she's not here today. So I'm just going to commit her to all sorts of stuff, but I promise that we've been working with her. She's seen these surveys and, we've exchanged some information there. And we, I think we understand the best we can, given that we don't do this every day. That it could take some work in order to come up with these estimates. You hopefully have, because we're asking it to be based on actual built projects or projects that are, far along enough in the design right now to be able to at least have that starting, the baseline before the current scenario. But the projection on what scenario one would cost, we definitely understand that could take a little bit of work and some back and forth, and that it requires the cooperation of the utility. So we've done our best to work with them. They're members of the working group, to get some commitments on them providing you some assistance there. And if you're finding that that is not happening like we had hoped, please feel free to reach out, and we can do some facilitation and maybe try and get some folks together to provide that information.
Okay.
If there's, it's just one of those things. It's an overwhelming task to try and figure out what the cost differences are on some of these things. So it's complicated, and we wanted to simplify it as much as we could without oversimplifying it. But in any scenario we came up with, it is going to take that interaction to know what the proposed ordinance options would cost between developers and NV Energy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Marcy, can I ask a question?
I'm sorry, but just let me finish up on that. So with respect to that and the facilities, we certainly have a good handle on what the additional facilities would be for the conduit or feeds, whatever it may be. But going back to that line extension, do you want us to reach out directly to Marie, or do you want us to just leave that section blank so that she can look at it en masse of all of the projects?
We were anticipating that you guys would reach out directly
to Marie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Will do.
Okay.
And first Greg, and then I think that was Virginia.
Yeah, hi. So I just thought I'd let the members of the work group know that NDEP has filed an initial agency draft of Clean Cars 2 regulations. So this would pick up after Clean Cars 1, which is for model year 2025. So we're going to be starting a process of outreach and associated with evaluating adoption of Clean Cars 2, which would run through model year 2035. And so we're probably not scheduled to start that process until later this year. But I wanted to follow up on the reason I'm mentioning this is that Deborah Reardon had talked about what could be the estimated benefits from charging infrastructure. And so we recognize that projected adoption rates of zero emission vehicles in Nevada, will be affected not only by, market conditions, but also availability of charging infrastructure. And so I think as we analyze that, we could be communicating with Clark County about maybe the methodologies and assumptions we use for how infrastructure will potentially affect zero emission vehicle adoption rates and kind of vice versa. So I'm sure there's people who have done work in this area, but I think we probably want to communicate about being somewhat consistent there. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great, thank you. And was there another question or comment?
I can't find the raise hand thing, so I apologize for not using it.
Oh, no
I'm not
worries.
exactly sure where it is. So too many different virtual apps.
Yeah.
So this is Virginia. I hope you will give some consideration to how this is implemented and phased in, because I think there needs to be some harmonization between generation capacity, distribution infrastructure, consumer acceptance, even delivery of the vehicles. I ordered a delivery of an EV. It's been delayed 3 times now. And the deeper we get into this conversation, the more I'm thinking, do I really want to encounter a brownout next summer or 2 summers from now and not be able to go anywhere? So I think a lot of things have to happen at the same time to make the community ready for all of this. So I hope that there will be consideration given to some flexibility if any one of those pieces lags, generation, distribution, supply, consumer acceptance, then somebody's going to wind up spending a lot of money for something that isn't really going to work. So I think there should be some optimization of all of those things so that it happens at a pace that makes sense. So it's a complicated issue, and I'll stop there. I think I've probably made my point.
Yeah, go ahead, Marcy.
Yeah, no, I think we completely agree, Virginia, absolutely. And that's why we've appreciated NV Energy participating. So, before we sent the survey out with the options, again, my best friend, Marie Steele, sent these to her and I'm like, all right, if we put these out there, scenarios 1, 2, or 3, are these absorbable? Are you prepared? And so, one thing that NV Energy shared with us is that they're starting to review their own design standards. I think their president and CEO has been out starting to pitch this and prepare everyone for, they're looking at their own assumptions for residential development or multifamily development or, commercial resorts, et cetera, and realizing that, the assumptions they've been making are sort of underestimating the potential load. So they're working on that now.
And I appreciate that. And I would just say, and I love Marie Steele too. It's in some ways Nevada Energy, if they can show a demand, they go into their rate making and their PUCN dockets, and being a monopoly, they build it and they earn on what they build. And so for them, they're gonna respond to whatever you guys tell them to do. So I do think it needs to be balanced against across all of those sectors I mentioned. It's not just an MBE thing, because they're going to earn what they earn based on whatever they build, and the more they build, the better they do, right? So I just think we should be careful about what the drivers are.
Yeah, yep, I agree.
Amanda?
Hi, thank you. So my question is more in terms of timing and implementation of data collection and not necessarily ordinance effective date. I know that, in industry always asks for some leeway, especially, after land has already been purchased or designs have already been done. Hopefully those communities will not have to redesign under new design standards. But the challenge that we're going to have on the residential side in collecting some of this data is in line with NV Energy's rate case and current tariff versus future tariff. So can you talk a little bit about that, of how we're going to ensure that we are, comparing oranges to oranges, even across communities? I might have a community that is designed differently under the new rates, in the next, 3 months. So in terms of how long we have to collect this data, and then how we're going to make sure that the data is accurate and, transferable to the new rate.
When do you think would be a good time, and I'll throw this out to the group, of when we can have these returned? What
So
are you
if I could add real quick, April, so what we're suggesting in terms of guidance and project selection is to select projects that have been built basically within the last year or will be done by the end of this year. And so you'll see in the guidance, I mean, we document some assumptions here and some bounds on the analysis there. We totally agree, Amanda. There are every single development has its own fact pattern and its own costs. And, while we hear a lot about how everything's cookie cutter in Vegas, nothing is cookie cutter in Vegas. So that does represent a challenge on trying to represent sort of a number that is a one-stop shop. But, we have to do our best to collect a set of representative, what people would consider consistent with what gets built here in the Valley, understanding. And then again, as Virginia mentions, how that data gets represented, it's not a be all end all. Every project is going to be a little bit different. So, we would ask for you guys to select projects that you think are as well representative as they can be for Southern Nevada single family residential development. And it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be an all-encompassing cost analysis on every scenario that may be encountered. We just cannot possibly be expected to do that, nor would we want to subject you all to doing that. So what we're trying to provide back to the board is an imperfect and yet representative conclusion on what the difference in cost would be in each of these different development scenarios. So, and I understand all of its warts and all of its imperfections, but there's no one perfect way to represent costs.
So I think if it's okay, after we select the 3 samples, we'll reach out to you and your team and make sure that those are in line with kind of the goals of doing our best to conceptualize this before we submit the final back to you guys as the official results of our industry.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, go ahead, April. I interrupted you.
Oh, no worries. And just as far as timing, Marcy, are you hoping, so we have our August, September, October, November, and December meetings left. Is our hope to have these by the September one final, or August?
Well,
August
I like where, yeah. I like where you were going with getting some feedback from members who are going to help complete these. What seems realistic and doable to folks?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I'll just pick a month.
Is August
I,
too?
I like I like September because that's when we'll see the first, hopefully the first draft of the new filing. So we'll be able to at least see whether or not we need to go back to the drawing board if the new rate structure is wildly different than the current one, but that gives us at least enough time to get all the data under the current structure.
Okay.
I think August is much too soon personally, as a staff of Matt and myself, trying to make sure that we're doing this on top of.
Okay, that makes sense. Any other feedback on September as a deadline for having the cost estimates completed? And if not, we will go to Rod and then Justin.
So September would work for commercial development, so that's not a problem. The question I had, Marcy, for you, as we're anticipating these, additional costs, and then this is not what this work group is for, but do we also factor in potential increased power demands in the event there's, something done with respect to evaporative cooler and having to, do a conversion away from evaporative coolers to mechanical coolers, which is going to be another tremendous draw on the NV Energy system?
Yeah, so that's why we did add a non-cost related question, and that's the total demand, the load difference from current to proposed, so that we can see what that difference is and make sure that we're checking back with NV Energy on, all right, so this is what the difference would be in these representative projects. And yeah, taking that into consideration with everything else that's going on, how do they feel about that? I will say one thing that we see this ordinance as an opportunity is to make some of this a little bit more predictable for all of us in the utility. Right now, when everyone's sort of doing whatever it is that they're doing, it's very unpredictable. And what NV Energy can see is that their working assumptions on design standards are no longer representative of what's getting built, but it is sort of all over the place. And so one advantage of an ordinance is that it would give some predictability and some consistency, at least in the electric vehicle infrastructure space. So I'll just throw that out there. I don't know that everyone will be convinced by that, but from a local government perspective, we see that as some utility to adopting an ordinance that kind of standardizes this a little bit. So I think Justin's next.
Go ahead, Justin.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So throughout this, it appears that the majority of it is targeted towards more of the retail consumer and homeowner residential aspect. Being from the Fleet Association, I was wondering how much of this is going to be directed towards like fleet parking. When you have, whether it be package delivery, FedEx, UPS, there's still, spots for fleet vehicles, companies that have, medium to large size fleets with vehicles that return to base every night. Just kind of what does that look like for those types of customers and consumers?
And go ahead, Marcy.
No, go ahead, April.
Oh, I was going to say, we do have the use case for distribution and industrial. And so fleets could be considered within that location, because we are assuming that there will, be some electrification of those locations. But Marcy, go ahead and fill in anything else there.
Yeah, so we weren't anticipating in the ordinance that we would require businesses that may be looking at electrifying their fleets to install a certain number of chargers. That is an area where we completely understand that the market and that business might need to drive and match up what they need in terms of infrastructure with the fleet that they're going to purchase and operate, and that we couldn't necessarily predict that. But I do think that speaks to this coordination issue that is being raised about where the market's going, and is our local utility prepared for that. And I think that's where the Fleet Association comes in, Justin. I think that's a great place to connect with NV Energy and talk with the big fleet operators here about what their future plans are, and stay in that close coordination with NV Energy. And then I also think, we've talked about and are working on an updated Clean Cities Coalition designation. And so there can be some coordination and communication in that venue as well. But as it pertains to an ordinance, we weren't necessarily going to get into dictating how many electric vehicle chargers a business had to have for its electrified fleet.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
And I think that also leads to just a broader point, and to get back to Virginia's question, because there are so many pieces to the regional transportation electrification puzzle. So this ordinance would be one piece of a larger transportation electrification strategy. And this year, while we're focused on light duty, next year the focus will be medium and heavy duty. And so from a fleet perspective, as Marcy said, it's so important that we're engaging even on this transportation electrification strategy, as well as the ones that are taking place nationally. So there's the NEVI meetings that are happening, and those are looking at how they're going to be implementing federal dollars into corridors throughout Nevada. There's the Clean Cities strategy. There's the Clean Cars too. So there's a lot of work that's going on in this area. And as we do work to develop the strategy focused on Clark County, we're taking all of those efforts into consideration as well. So I know that there was a comment in regards to an education and outreach effort in regards to clean cars. So there's a lot of work being done in that, and we'll be taking all of that into consideration as to how we'll move this forward. Any other comments, questions? Okay, so what I'll go ahead and do is right after this meeting, I'll go ahead and send out an email that has the presentation that you just saw on it, and I'll go ahead and attach all of the Word documents. I think there's 5 of them. There's single family and all the other 4 use cases. So obviously pick your own use case. And if there is someone that you would like to share this with that wasn't at the meeting, feel free to share this. And then they can also reach out directly to myself as well, or Marcy. Great. All right. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, thanks, Justin. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. We appreciate it.